What's up and welcome to My Point of View. I am your fat and opinionated host, and man, oh man, this Bryan Kohberger case is like a freaking roller coaster. I just got back from visiting some theme parks, and I gotta say that this case has been more thrilling. There's been more ups and downs in this case than a freaking amusement park ride. While I was on vacation, there was so much news coming in out of nowhere. It's like there was an explosion of news. It's almost as if the universe knew, like, hey, this guy's on vacation. He's not making content for a couple of days. Let's go ahead and drop all the news right now. But anyways, while I was on vacation, I lost some confidence in this case. Let's just call it that. If you all watched my last video, then I explained why. But then, out of nowhere, it's like we got this trickle of it's hard to call it good news, right? But good news somewhat. I mean, we have been getting a lot of bad news when it comes to the Bryan Kohberger case. Like with the knife sheath, like with the internal investigations, with the house being destroyed. There was a lot of bad news, and it made me feel like, I'm not as sure about this case as I was a few days ago. But now we're starting to get additional information. And some of that information I'm going to go over later, but right now I want to talk about the fact that Bryan Kohberger is now under investigation in Pennsylvania. Now, if you've been following this case, you know that once Bryan Kohberger got arrested, they talked about how they were going to look into other cases. They were going to poke around and just see what's going on, because it's hard for most people to believe that this is the first crime like this that Bryan has committed. And, you know, in my opinion, usually, and from things that we see, it's not even my opinion, from experience looking into these cases, usually someone doesn't start out like this. Now, of course, you can, and there's other situations that have happened in the past where killers have started out like this, but typically you don't start off with 4 victims in this house with other people. It's a very complicated crime that Bryan pulled off. How he pulled it off, I don't know. Honestly, there's no reason why Bryan pulled this crime off. If you want to be honest, because a certain someone in that house should have called 911 on the spot, and Bryan would have been caught minutes later, and we wouldn't even be here having this discussion. But because someone decided, I'm not going to call the cops, I'm too traumatized, I'm going to walk into my room. Because we had that to deal with, here we are now. And it's hard for me to believe that Bryan started out like this. Usually, someone who's capable of doing something like what Bryan did, they have it in them. And usually it comes out in different ways. So maybe Bryan hasn't taken the life of anyone else. Maybe not. But I think there's a huge possibility that he has. I also think there's a huge possibility that he's harmed animals, done other things. Usually you don't just start off with taking the lives of 4 people. Law enforcement feels the same way. Make no mistake about it. Investigators in law enforcement feel the same way. Any of them that have spoken out about this case have all said the same thing. So it was announced that they were going to start looking into cold cases in Pennsylvania. They were going to look into cases just to see if there's anything that could possibly be tied to Bryan Kohberger. Well, now the news is coming out that they've basically identified some cases, and now Bryan Kohberger is under investigation in Pennsylvania. Don't get your hopes up. Don't go too crazy with this little information. No one is saying that Bryan has been labeled as the main suspect or a suspect in any of these cases, but knowing that they said they were going to look into these cases, and now they've identified some of the cases that they think may possibly be tied to Bryan Kohberger, that is a huge step. And I'm really wondering what happens here. What happens if we wake up tomorrow the next day and we find out that they believe Bryan Kohberger is tied to other crimes, other deaths? Then this story is going to take a whole new turn. This story has already been crazy enough. This case is going to be a case that people talk about and look back on for years. They'll probably make movies about this case if they're not already in the process of doing so. Lifetime, I'm looking at you. So if they can connect Bryan Kohberger to possibly other homicides, that's going to be insane. But I want you all to watch this clip real quick, and then I'll be back with more thoughts.
Chris Cuomo reporting exclusively from law enforcement sources that Bryan Kohberger, the suspect in the Idaho murders, is now being investigated for possible additional murders in the state of Pennsylvania. Now remember, Kohberger was arrested at his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania on December 30th. It's a month and a half after the brutal killings of the University of Idaho students Ethan Chapin, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Kaylee Gonzalez. We know Kohberger grew up in the Pocono Mountains in Pennsylvania before moving out to Washington State near the Idaho border for grad school. We also know he previously graduated from Northampton Community College in Pennsylvania in 2018, and that while there, he worked security for the Pleasant Valley School District. He also attended nearby DeSales University until 2022, both schools about an hour away from where his parents live. Now, when news of Kohberger's arrest first broke, Pennsylvania authorities said they were going to go back with a fine-tooth comb. They were going to look at open and cold cases that may have fit the MO of the Idaho killer. It was one of the first things that local officials did, looking for any connection between Kohberger and unsolved cases in the area. Kohberger remains in an Idaho jail tonight, awaiting his preliminary hearing in June. Authorities have said he has no official and known prior criminal record. Joining me now on this breaking news is former CIA and FBI agent Tracy Walder. She's also a News Nation national security contributor. Thanks very much for coming on the program. Appreciate it. So I guess it shouldn't be that surprising that this investigation started, right, in the state of Pennsylvania. But now the fact that they may have identified particular cases, that sure is a development.
Well, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Dan. So, I think really what investigators had at their disposal now, once he was arrested, was really access to VICAP, or the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. And really what they have there is the benefit of basically going into a database clearinghouse and looking for crimes that had similar patterns, similar manner of death, similar motivations, those kinds of things. And I think that really probably helped them put the pieces of the puzzle together, as well as now having his DNA, because quite frankly, if they did have a murder, his DNA wouldn't have come up as a hit. As you mentioned, he had no prior criminal record. So I think the fact that he has committed other crimes is perhaps not surprising.
And, again, this often happens in these investigations, right? Suspect is arrested in one place for a crime, somewhere else, and then they begin an investigation and turn up other information.
Exactly. I mean, this is probably more common than not. And also, I think if you just look at the nature of this crime, this is an individual that went into a house where there was potentially 5 people there that he would have had to kill. I think he probably had some experience in doing this. Just sort of all of those signatures and all of that evidence point to the fact that this was probably not his first time attempting something like this. It may not have been against 5 people, but it may have been him experimenting, doing something like this against one person or perhaps even 2. And also, he does have a history of sort of erratic, perhaps sexist behavior and sort of a hatred towards women. So it's really not surprising seeing some of this come out now.
And it's possible, by the way, that they're going back in cases that they thought they had a suspect, right? And maybe they didn't even have the right person and they were looking the wrong way.
Absolutely. We look at this and how he was found partially was because of that familial DNA. And really, no one in his family would have had their DNA in any kind of criminal system. No one in there had a criminal record. No one had DNA taken. And so it's quite possible that they had built another suspect around other characteristics that he was nowhere on their radar.
So yeah, as you heard, folks, and as you can see, almost anybody that's talking about this case finds it hard to believe that Bryan would have started out this way. And I find that hard to believe as well. But I will say this. I'm kind of torn. Because, all right, in typical situations like this, I would definitely say this is not Bryan's first time. This is not Bryan's first rodeo. That Bryan probably killed someone else before. And, I still strongly feel like that's a big possibility. Anyone who thinks that's not a possibility hasn't looked into enough of these cases. But the other half of me, this is where I'm struggling here. Because, in other cases, we see a build-up, right? You see a build-up to the culmination. Like other killers, if you study them and how they moved and what happened in those cases, you typically can see a build-up to them committing a crime or to them taking a life. Like you see a build-up of a kid having a troubled childhood, a kid doing terrible things, being a problem child, a kid hurting animals, a kid then hurts a human, a kid then takes a human's life. You know what I mean? Like you see that process, if you will. The build-up. When it comes to Bryan Kohberger, I think the build-up to this crime can be way different. Usually the build-up to taking someone else's life is a chain of other crimes, and other bad doings that eventually led someone down that path to start taking people's lives. With Bryan Kohberger, and I've said this from day one, I've been really consistent. I feel like Bryan Kohberger's education could have been his buildup. So when you have typical killers and typical criminals like Bryan, the buildup is different. The buildup is little things and actions and things they did throughout their life to build up to the day that they do something really terrible and really crazy. When it comes to Bryan Kohberger, I feel like some of that buildup over the years has just been his education. Him educating himself. Him learning whatever he could about crime scenes and these investigations, about the mind of a killer. Him going through all of these things, knowing that eventually he was going to do what he did. I don't know if he had a victim in mind, but I do think that Bryan Kohberger knew for years that he was going to do what he did. I feel like the pursuit of his education was for that sole purpose of him eventually doing something like what he allegedly did. Let's say that. So part of me is battling within myself because I feel like, typically when you see someone that has done something like what Bryan Kohberger is accused of doing, it's almost a given that they have taken lives or they have done something really heinous in the past. It's almost a given. But on the other hand, I think Bryan Kohberger is a special case here. Because I do feel like for Bryan, a lot of that buildup didn't necessarily have to be Bryan doing bad things or horrible things, but Bryan studying other people who did bad things and horrible things. So Bryan didn't need that buildup. Bryan vicariously lived through other killers to get that buildup, if you will. You know what I mean? Instead of building himself up and working himself up to do something like this, he learned about other people who went that path and then built himself up and worked himself up through his education to eventually take the lives of 4 young individuals. That's my opinion, speculation if you want to call it that. We don't know Bryan's true motive yet. Everyone has their own opinions. I think it's a little more complicated than, oh, Bryan just hates women. That's really simple. I think it's more complicated than that, for sure. But that's basically the main talking point that people are running with. Let me know your thoughts, though, down in the comments while you're down there. Hit the thumbs up, hit the subscribe. ring that notification bell, and remember to always remain opinionated.